On First Peter, back again on this study of hope, what it means to have hope. And today we're in chapter 4, and we're going to be doing verses 1 and 2, and then verses 12 through 14, and then finally verses 15 through 19. I challenge you once again, guys, girls, the writer of this lesson has a particular place that they're trying to go with the lesson. But for you and I to fully understand what all is there, we need to have a really good idea of the context. And so I challenge you to read those verses that are in between. They're good verses. They help us understand more of what is happening in this overall situation that Peter is challenging us with. So today we're talking about hope, and specifically the joy that we have in hope. And so as I was thinking about the word joy, I was trying to figure out a way to describe it. And probably the simplest way to describe joy is Christmas morning. And what I mean by that is joy is more than simply happiness. Joy is more than just contentment. Joy has some amazement in it. It has some awe in it. Joy has definitely contentedness and elation in it. It has some surprise in it. I think all of those words can come together to help us understand what the word joy means. And Peter challenges us to find joy in suffering. Now I want you to think and picture Christmas morning, and then I want you to picture suffering, and I want you to help, as we go through this lesson, try to realize the contrast that is there, and specifically to understand why the contrast is there. Why is it that Christmas morning brings so much joy, and yet suffering does not? Why is it that getting gifts and spending time with family brings so much joy, and yet being told no, or being ridiculed, or being mocked because we won't participate, or because we won't go along with certain behaviors, or because we're denying ourselves because we believe that's what God has called us to do? Why does it not bring about the same amount of joy? And so we're going to look at that today and just remind ourselves of the role that we play and the relationship that we have with Christ. So we'll kick it off in 1 Peter chapter 4. And we're going to start, as I said, with verses 1 through 2. And this is what Peter says. Therefore, since Christ suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves also with the same understanding. Because the one who suffers in the flesh is finished with sin, in order to live the remaining time in the flesh, no longer for human desires, but for God's will. I want you to pause for just a minute and remind yourself of why Jesus suffered. Jesus suffered because he told the religious people, the Pharisees, that belief in him was greater than belief in the temple and the practices of the temple. Jesus suffered because he healed someone in a way that made the religious uncomfortable. Jesus suffered because he healed people who made the religious uncomfortable. Jesus suffered because he denied himself, and every opportunity that he had to defend himself, he turned and let others do it, or let it not happen at all. In fact, the few times the disciples actually tried to defend him, he usually allowed the person through that was trying to get through the disciples. Just a little thought here, okay? I know some of you guys are homeschooled. I know some of you attend different ways. But Jesus didn't suffer for carrying his Bible to school. And he didn't suffer for wearing a Christian t-shirt. And a lot of times we want to equate social, to use a word we're using right now, social distancing from others as a way of suffering. And that is not always the case. In fact, sometimes we want to bring this upon ourselves to prove how well we're able to contain suffering. Can I remind you how Peter suffered? the man who wrote this, do you remember the story that Jesus told him as they ate supper that night? And he said, Peter, before the night is over, you will deny me 3 times. Peter said, no, I won't, Jesus. And he tried so hard not to. He went where Jesus was. He allowed himself to get close to the action. But ultimately, he denied Jesus to preserve his own skin. And when he did, he suffered greatly. He suffered in the fact that he denied Jesus. He suffered in that he felt like his life was in danger if he did not deny him. And so when Peter wrote this passage on suffering, he understood what it means, and he understood that it meant denial of self, something that he was unwilling to do on that dark, cold night when Jesus was brought to trial. But I want you to understand what Peter says here. He says suffering is part of the process that helps rid us of sin. Now, a lot of people seem to think that one day we're going to die and we're going to go to heaven and God's going to zap us as we go through the door, and that's going to be it. But one of the responsibilities that we have on earth as followers of Christ is to begin to rid ourselves, even right now, of sin. And you say, well, wait a minute, hold on. Is that why I'm supposed to be living a certain way and watching this and not watching that and reading this and not reading that? Well, that definitely can be a part of it. But remember this, sin is simply missing the mark that God has called us to love God and to love our neighbors. And so Peter says this, as you suffer, you are finished with sin. Well, why is that the case? Well, suffering allows us to see the temporary reality and the temporary value of our personal desires. Suffering allows us to see how fragile some of the things are that we want. Right now, you guys may be thinking you want fame, you want fortune, you want to be at the top of your class. And I think of some of you all who compete athletically. And for the last 3 months, you have literally been unable to do that. Where is your identity? Where is your identity when you can't go out on the field or out on the court? I was faced with that several years ago when I went from being I was a bivocational pastor, and then I went straight from that to being a bivocational youth pastor. And then I went through 7 months where I did not do any of that at all. I literally taught one Bible study during that time period. And I was forced to evaluate who was I in Christ? Could I be a Christian without being in service? Could I be a Christian without being a teacher? Could I be a Christian without those responsibilities that helped shape my identity? And I ask you this, can you be a follower of Christ without hitting the athletic field or hitting the competition in the academics or whatever it may be? Suffering allows us to understand the temporary value of our personal desires. And I think that's one of the understandings when Peter says this, in order to live the remaining time in the flesh, no longer for human desires, but for God's will. So understand that suffering allows us to begin to rid ourselves of selfish behavior. The second part that we see in this suffering, and we're going to look at verses 12 through 14 here. Let me read them to you. Dear friends, don't be surprised when the fiery ordeal comes among you to test you as if something unusual were happening to you. Instead, rejoice as you share in the sufferings of Christ, so that you may also rejoice with great joy when his glory is revealed. If you are ridiculed for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rests on you. Now, to get a better picture of this, you need to go back and read verses 7 through 11, when he talks about how the Gentiles live. And basically, the Gentiles lived in a way that is not too unfamiliar to us today. And what I mean by that is they just did what they felt like doing. If it was a Monday, they did Monday things. If it was a weekend, they did weekend things. And I think about how our lives have been challenged in the last 3.5 months. As your parents and you have had to reconsider some of the decisions that you make, some of the places that you go. And Peter is simply saying this, that in suffering, when we begin to set aside a service to God as our priority, this gives us this wonderful opportunity to identify with Christ. And he says, and when you do that, don't be surprised what happens. Don't be surprised when this fiery ordeal comes on you. And he says, rejoice as you share in the sufferings of Christ. So embrace the difficulties of your life. But now listen to me very closely here. Embrace them as they point to Christ. Are you becoming more humble, more meek, more gentle, more kind, more serving? If you're not, then you're not necessarily suffering for Christ. You may be suffering, but if your attitudes and your behaviors aren't pointing to Christ, then you don't need to embrace that. You need to embrace the behavior that helps point you to Christ. That dialing back of your selfish interests. Think about this. If you're 14, 15, 16, 17, whatever age you may be, now imagine yourself in a foot race with a 4-year-old. Now imagine how you would run that foot race. Would you run at full blast and beat them by 30 yards and turn around and say, yeah, I skunked you? Or would you slow down and kind of help that person run with that challenge and encourage them to race with you and to challenge with you? Well, Peter is saying that as we point to Christ, we embrace the difficulties that come in our life. He says this, instead, rejoice in the sufferings. Rejoice as you share in the sufferings of Christ, so that you may also rejoice with great joy when his glory is revealed. In other words, your role in suffering is not to beat suffering down like you could beat a 4-year-old in a race. But in other words, it is as you go through that suffering to be rejoicing in who Christ is and reveling in what he has done for us. And so that our tendency is to allow his glory to come through us instead of our ability to trump or to beat down the sufferings. If you are ridiculed for the name of Christ, now remember why Jesus was ridiculed. You are blessed because the Spirit of glory and of God rests on you. Suffering can simply, it is a lot of things. It is a lot of things. I have seen people suffer horribly physically. I've seen them suffer horribly through losses and through emotional needs and circumstances. But at its simplest, suffering is simply not getting your way. How do we find joy in not getting our way? Well, it can only be found in the person of Jesus and in the behaviors of Jesus. And so, as he wraps this up, Peter points us to this idea of knowing our place. Let me read verses 15 through 19. Let none of you suffer as a murderer, a thief, an evildoer, or a meddler. In other words, don't do something ridiculous and then say, yeah, I'm suffering. That's what Christians are called to do. We're called to suffer. Look at me, I'm suffering over here. It's sort of like not studying for a test and failing it and then telling your mom, well, that teacher just doesn't like me, and yet you didn't study and you didn't do the work. Well, this is what's happening with Peter here. He says, but if anyone suffers as a Christian, as a follower of Jesus, as someone whose behavior is seeking to exemplify the service and the sacrifice of Jesus, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in having that name. And then he says a verse that's difficult, and I don't want to delve too far into it this evening in our lesson here. He says, for the time has come for judgment to begin with God's household. And if it begins with us, what will the outcome be for those who disobey the gospel of God? And if a righteous person is saved with difficulty, what will become of the ungodly and the sinner? And in those verses, we just get this glimpse of how close it is between those who love God and those who do not. Now, I don't want to just confuse you there, but I want you to think for just a minute. How close is it? How close does your life look like other people who don't love God? How close does your life resemble them? Is it really close? Can you tell a difference? And is the difference in your moral behavior? Is the difference in your commitment to service to God? Is the difference, where's the difference at? How do you define it? What would you define it as? And he says this, so then let those who suffer according to God's will entrust themselves to a faithful Creator while doing what is good. Peter's final challenge is this: trust God. Trust God. Let your behavior be of someone who absolutely believes that God is in control. as I read this passage and study it and teach it, I know this. I have not suffered like others have suffered. People that I know, people that I love and care about. And I've not suffered like they have. So I want to be very careful when I challenge you with this. But I will say that you and I need to understand that when we suffer in a way that allows others to see the goodness of God in our lives. God bless you. I'll see you next time.